Dee 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 ba doo ba doo ba doo bum.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Inside Amanda's Brain. I am your interviewer, and today we have a wonderful guest. Surprise, surprise, Amanda Kunkel is joining us. Amanda, thank you for being here. And thank you for putting in some effort into the way you look. How are you today, Amanda?
Well, I've been better. I'm having a hard time
That
focusing.
is wonderful to
and
hear. Now you're here today to talk about your latest masterpiece, Recognition. For those few people who haven't read it yet, can you give us a brief overview of the story?
Yeah, I can definitely do that. So Recognition is the story of a portrait writer, Dean Vanderboom, and an ambitious voyeur, Robert Hill, who the writer calls the Watcher. The writer agrees to meet the Watcher and determine whether or not he has an interesting enough story to tell the world. Along the way, the writer begins to realize that he's not so different from the Watcher, and he has to navigate the unseemly world of voyeurism while the Watcher says or does whatever he can to become recognized for the great mind that he thinks he has. It's a story about the line between legal and not legal, truth and lies, and the inability to recognize one's own faults in the pursuit of a goal.
That is absolutely fascinating. One of my favorite stories to come out of your Google Drive in the last week. But this one is written in sections, and each section switches from the writer to the Watcher's point of view. What made you decide to write it like that?
Yeah, so I was sitting on my couch, silently panicking about the coronavirus, as we all do, and I started to think about what a virus actually does. It's an invisible enemy that sneaks into your body and overwhelms your normal behavior. I started to think about what that might mean for a story, what that might look like. So while I was sitting there going through a bout of heart palpitations, the only way to calm myself down was to watch Netflix. I put on a documentary, and the germ for this story was planted. Over the next several days, it spread throughout my body until I had to get it out. The only way that I could think of to write this in the shape of a virus was by switching point of views in each section. Show through each character's mind how the other person was infecting them.
That sounds terrifying. Can you give us some examples of what you mean by infecting each person?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I'm here for. In the very first section, we're in the writer's mind. This part is just after he got off the phone with the Watcher for the first time, and this is where we see the germ implanted. He went on to introduce himself as Robert, with a silent T, like the French say it. But I was already packing my bags to leave. From what he said, he had been studying his lodgers since he bought the house in 1972. The way he spoke, he sounded like he was doing some great service to the world by cataloging these events. His cognitive dissonance had pushed away all sense of right and wrong, and he had managed to convince himself that he wasn't breaking the law by spying on people. I had to know more, and even if this turned out to be a wild goose chase, it still made a better story than the one I was working on about the elusive smuggler. Robert the Watcher is obviously not French, but he pronounces his name that way in order to set himself apart and make himself seem more interesting. This detail comes into play later when the writer, who has consistently referred to himself as a journalist, calls himself a literary portraiteur. Vanderboom correctly goes on to say that Robert has convinced himself that watching people without their consent is okay. His experience working with other criminals has helped him come to this conclusion without any sort of moral judgment attached to it. And this is his own form of cognitive dissonance, which of course he cannot see for himself. Page 7, the two meet, and the writer is struck by the incongruity between the image he'd formed of the Watcher in his mind and the reality of the man. He says, "His lips weren't thick, nor were they thin. They were liminal in their space, somewhere in between, and his teeth were the sort of gray that came from half-hearted dental care. He wore an old-fashioned tweed suit that I imagined the professors at Harvard would have worn back in the 60s. It hung loose on his shoulders, almost as if he had stolen it from someone else's closet and worn the clothes in order to become someone other than himself. The hat was the sort of thing that I would have expected from a mobster in New York. Nothing about him added up to the picture I'd formed in my mind from our telephone conversation. That only made me want to learn more. The virus is spreading. Once the watcher brings the writer into his observation deck, where he watches the guests at his bed and breakfast through the grates in the ceiling, the writer says this: "Truth be told, I never wanted to see Robert Hill again. After spending several hours in his attic, I felt dirtier than ever, right through to my soul. I saw the appeal of what he was doing and could have easily turned the corner into his sinister world. We were both students of behavior with just one key element to separate us: consent. The people I wrote about all knew. Robert's victims were unwitting. If I had stayed in Virginia, I would have lived in his attic, getting the real stories without the veneer people shielded themselves from the world with. I didn't want to cross that line, so I hid from it." That's it. He's stuck. He has the disease. And for the rest of the story, no matter what lies the watcher tells him, no matter how many times the watcher is caught in those lies, the writer reasons to himself that he can still get the story, get it out, get that book deal, and become recognized for the true genius writer that he believes himself to be. Sorry, I'm just looking at my notes here, and this doesn't sound like the shape from your abstract or any shape from Allison's book that you all studied this semester. What's going on there? Like, honestly, that just feels like a lifetime ago. I couldn't wrap my head around any of that if I tried. I'm lucky to be able to focus right now. Like, you're lucky that you're getting anything out of me. Can we just move on with what I actually was able to achieve? Hey! Don't shoot the messenger. I'm just asking the questions that our viewers are going to want answered. Are there any other ways that these two men infect one another? Yeah, there definitely are, but I don't want to give everything away. But I will point out a few more subtle sections where it's not necessarily the men infecting one another, but their shared time in the narrative. Each section sort of builds off the last, kind of like a wave. But in order to achieve that, there's also some overlap. For instance, when the watcher first sees the writer, he says, "He had a full head of dark brown hair, styled like those cats in Miami Vice. If he'd had sunglasses on, he could have passed for Don Johnson in a heartbeat, right down to the gold chain necklace." And when we switch back to the writer, we learn, "Stepping out of my car to get a better look, I shielded my eyes from the sun. I'd forgotten my sunglasses back in Illinois and couldn't bring myself to buy a generic pair from the gas station." So now we learn that he didn't have sunglasses on, and then we learn why in the next section. And they're like a page apart from each other. So you have to really be paying attention to the little ways in which they overlap and infect each other's sections. Now, Allison talks about the use of color directing a narrative and helping to make connections without explicitly stating them. Can you talk a little bit about what you tried to do with color in recognition? Yeah, for sure. Let's track yellow. When the writer first speaks to the watcher on the phone, he hears him smacking his gums, and he tries to imagine what the mouth that makes that sound would look like. And he wonders if the watcher's teeth are pearly white or jagged corn kernels. And later, when the writer first arrives at the bed and breakfast, he sees that the house has crackled white paint, yellowed by the sun, almost as if it was being kept alive just for the sake of it and not for the joy. A piece of the past that no one wanted but couldn't live without. Here we get a deeper meaning for what the yellow means, the white turning into the yellow. These two transformations, white to yellow, new to old, represent not only the watcher's physical appearance, but also each man's fading star. Neither one of them is getting any younger, and their chances to get the sort of recognition they feel they deserve are dwindling. The last place where we see yellow is near the end when they're both looking over some notes, and the watcher says, "It's all right there in my notes," I said, tapping the yellow legal pad in front of him with my middle finger. Neither one of them care that what they're doing is illegal, because by this point, the writer has also engaged in acts of voyeurism. They're both determined to leave their legacy through any means necessary. Well, we're just about out of time, so let's discuss your choice in terms of how you're presenting this story right now. Obviously, we aren't broadcasting live, and it seems a little unusual for you to hire such a famous interviewer for a school project. Have you lost your damn mind? Yes, absolutely. I was never completely sane to begin with, and this isolation has only made it worse. And now, like, everyone has fun going through a manic episode every now and then. I mean, have you ever spent an hour giggling at yourself because of how absurd your life has become? It's like a bi-hourly occurrence for me at this point. It's really not conducive to producing the sort of work that people have come to expect from me. So I'm just kind of doing what I can. But also, my story goes back and forth between the watcher and the writer, so I thought it might be kind of cool to have that same movement in my presentation. So I figured, I have the time, not busy, I have the skill set, I studied film, so let's make this presentation a little more interesting. There was also no way in hell I was going to be able to write this into a coherent essay, so a Q&A session with you, my favorite interviewer, was the only way that I could organize my thoughts and try to turn in something, because hey, a 50 is better than a 0. I know that's right. Amanda, it has been a pleasure talking to you about the work and all the effort it took to put into this presentation and your story. Thank you for being here. And thank you for watching. Join us next week when I ask the big questions that's been on everyone's mind. Amanda, what happened to your hair? Funny story, actually.